Hola, ¿qué tal? Estimados amigos, estimados hermanos que nos acompañan en esta entrevista especial que vamos a tener a continuación. Los saludamos a todos a nombre de los siguientes ministerios, como algunos ya los conocen. A nombre de Fe Razonable, por parte del filósofo analítico William Lane Craig. También los saludamos a nombre del ministerio de Facts, que ustedes, si ya pudieron estar con nosotros en el Congreso de julio pasado, en este año, ustedes pudieron ser testigos de un conjunto de conferencias de grandes eminencias en la apologética y en la teología. Pues bueno, ya recordarán este ministerio de Facts. Y también los saludamos a nombre del ministerio Redefensa. Ustedes pueden buscarnos, como ya lo saben, en Facebook, en nuestras páginas oficiales, en donde van a poder seguir encontrando videos, artículos, pensamientos, preguntas y muchas cosas más para que ustedes puedan interactuar y seguir creciendo en el conocimiento de los aspectos teológicos y apologéticos de la vida cristiana, que como está el mundo, se vuelven cada vez más relevantes. Una vez más, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Y en este día, como dicen aquí en México, estamos de manteles largos, porque nos acompaña en esta noche una eminencia de la erudición bíblica, una persona que ha formado escuela, que ha formado una tendencia de estudio que muchos cristianos de todas las ramas han seguido su trabajo, muchos han estado de acuerdo con él, muchos quizás no tanto, pero de que ha forjado conversaciones, tanto en el mundo de habla inglesa como en el mundo de habla española, es seguro que lo ha logrado. Así que en este día, y siguiendo la línea de entrevistas que hemos tenido, referentes al tema de la creación del mundo, de los 3 primeros capítulos de Génesis, que han sido tan controversiales desde el siglo XIX hasta nuestros días, por esta aparente lucha, digamos, entre la creación de Dios expresada en la Biblia y la evolución. Seguimos en esta línea de temas y ahora toca el turno para ni nada más ni nada menos que al doctor John Walton para poder escuchar su punto de vista en temas cruciales de estos primeros capítulos. Y en este día, Fe Razonable, Facts y Redefensa, gracias a Dios, hacen posible que el doctor Walton pueda dar esta entrevista para el público hispanoamericano. Así que en este momento me gustaría presentarles al doctor Walton y darle nuestros más respetuosos y cariñosos saludos. Estimado doctor Walton, dear Dr. Walton, you are welcome to this interview. Thank you for being with us here. So it's very nice to have you tonight.
My pleasure to be in this conversation.
Thank you very much. Así que, estimado público, ¿cuál va a ser la dinámica de esta entrevista? Bueno, va a haber una serie de preguntas. Unas de esas preguntas van a estar divididas en la categoría de la creación, tal como se relatan en los capítulos 1 y 2 de Génesis, y también hay algunas preguntas relacionadas con el tema de Adán y Eva, relacionadas también con el capítulo 3 de Génesis. Por lo tanto, vamos a comenzar con las preguntas de la creación, ¿sí? Y después vamos a pasar consecuentemente con las de Adán y Eva. Ahora bien, para la mayoría de las preguntas que se van a estar realizando, contamos con la presencia del director regional de capítulos de Fe Razonable en Latinoamérica. Muchos de ustedes ya lo ubican, nada más ni nada menos que a la eminencia Raúl Jaramillo. Hola Raúl, ¿cómo te encuentras el día de hoy?
Bien, un poco avergonzado que me están diciendo eminencia cuando apenas vamos empezando, ¿verdad? Pero gracias, David, por la oportunidad, gracias por organizar esto y pues vamos a darle hacia adelante. Creo que tenemos bastantes cosas que podemos aportar el día de hoy con esta entrevista.
Muchísimas gracias, Raúl. Y la verdad es que, estimado público, Raúl es humilde, es muy modesto, pero al final lo que Dios ha podido hacer a través de Raúl y a través del equipo de trabajo de Fe Razonable ha sido muy, muy grande. Y también contamos con el gran equipo de directores de capítulos de Fe Razonable en diferentes partes de Latinoamérica, cada uno con el respectivo ministerio que ha tenido. Y me gustaría en este momento dar un breve saludo a todos ellos. Contamos precisamente con la presencia de nuestro hermano Sebastián Pereira. Hola, hermano, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, ¿qué tal, hermanos? Muy buenas noches. La verdad que es un placer estar acá con ustedes.
Muchísimas gracias. Contamos también con el hermano Antonio Mata. ¿Cómo estás, Antonio?
¿Qué tal, David? Muy bien, muchas gracias. Igual muy contento de poder estar aquí con el doctor Walton y con todos ustedes.
Excelente, muchísimas gracias. Fernando Vega. Hola, Fernando, ¿cómo estás el día de hoy?
¿Qué tal, amigos? Muy bien, gracias a Dios. Saludos a todos los que nos ven. Muy emocionado y expectante por esta entrevista.
Muchísimas gracias. Y también contamos con la presencia de Job Santos. ¿Cómo estás hoy, Job?
¿Qué tal, hermanos? Muy buenas noches a todos. ¿Todo bien? Por aquí muy emocionado por tener al doctor Walton por fin con nosotros y esperemos que sea de mucha bendición para todos.
Claro que sí, todos estamos igual de emocionados y también contamos, como siempre, con la gran presencia de nuestro técnico, ¿verdad? La eminencia en molinismo en Latinoamérica, pero también una gran mentalidad detrás de las ediciones de los videos de Fe Razonable. Alan Sánchez, no sé si Alan pueda hablar. Hola, Alan, ¿cómo estás?
Bendiciones, no creo que salga en la grabación, pero ahí veré cómo me meto yo, ahí en la edición.
Perfecto. No, sí, Alan es el que mueve los hilos detrás de todo, así que es un hombre con mucho poder. Creo que ya los he saludado a todos, no me falta ninguna persona más, y pues
Sí,
bueno, sin más.
sí,
¿Quién
te falta
perdón?
Francisco Lugo,
Hola,
nuestro
Francisco
más
Lugo.
reciente director
Hola, buenas noches.
de
Buenas noches,
República
Francisco.
Dominicana.
Excelente, excelente. Aquí estamos representados, Estados Unidos con el doctor Walton, México, también está Argentina, también está República Dominicana. Así que considerando esta bonita reunión multicultural, sin más preámbulo, vamos a dar comienzo con esta entrevista. Abróchese sus cinturones porque estos temas van a estar muy apasionantes y esperemos que ustedes puedan apasionarse más y buscar más contenido después de esta entrevista. Ok, vamos a comenzar con las preguntas sobre la creación y me voy a animar a hacer la primera pregunta. Y a partir de la pregunta número 2, Raúl Jaramillo tomará la batuta. Así que en este momento procederé a cambiar del español a un inglés que obviamente lo hablo yo muy brutamente, pero que voy a dar mi mejor esfuerzo. Hello again, Dr. Walton. It's a great honor to have you in this interview. And the first question of the interview is about the creation story. And for Latin American people who are not familiar with the term cosmic temple, because we know that one of the concepts that you handle more in your books and your stories is precisely cosmic temple. So could you briefly explain the cosmic temple perspective on the contents of Genesis 1 to 3?
I would be happy to, David, and I'm so glad to be here and speak to all of you folks and answer some of these questions as best I can. When I first wrote The Lost World of Genesis 1, I talked about the idea of God creating a cosmic temple, that Genesis 1 presented the cosmos as a temple. And I think that idea is still very significant, but I have also begun talking about the idea that maybe it's even better to talk about the cosmos as sacred space. The reason I do that, a temple, of course, is sacred space. The sacred space is not space that somehow has some quality that invites God in. Instead, sacred space becomes sacred when God enters it. And so God's presence makes space sacred. So the temple is sacred space because God has come and inhabited the temple. When we talk about the cosmos, I believe also that Genesis 1 wants to tell us about how God came to inhabit the cosmos. He didn't create it as something out there. He created it as a place where he would dwell. And therefore his intention was to make the cosmos the place of his dwelling, sacred space. Now we could then talk about it as a cosmic temple. The one drawback from that terminology is that when you have a temple like Solomon's temple, There's that area that is inside the temple, but then there's an area that's outside the temple. With the cosmos, there's no inside and outside. And so in that sense, the temple concept doesn't quite communicate precisely what I'm after. I think sacred space does that better. So God creates the cosmos with the plan to dwell in it among the people that he created. And when he does so, it becomes sacred space, much like a temple is sacred space. I hope that clarifies it, makes it a little easier to understand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walton, for this explanation. I believe that for most of us, it is stated clearly, and we are going to do the next questions. And for this objective, Raúl Jaramillo is now going to take the lead of the question. So, Raúl, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that explanation, Dr. Walton. I didn't know personally that the concept of sacred space captured better the idea of your view. But let's go ahead with the second question. In your writings, you emphasize the importance of understanding Genesis in the light of contemporary pagan literature. And it's difficult when you think about it, because how can we explain to a church layman that has no idea of all the scholarship behind this that Genesis 1-3 should be interpreted in the context of pagan literature?
Well, basically, when we talk about this literature that we're comparing, we're simply talking about the literature that we know from the ancient world. Some of it's mythological literature, some of it is historical literature, some of it's wisdom literature, some of it is hymns and prayers. So there's a wide array of literature that we want to take account of. The reason why we're doing it is so that we can get to know ancient culture better. If I were to come down into Latin America and read something that was written in your context, I would have little chance of understanding its full depth if I didn't know more about Latin America, because the culture is a very important backdrop for understanding the literature that is written in that culture. And that's basically what I'm talking about with Genesis. If we want to understand Genesis as an ancient piece of literature, scripture, yes, but an ancient piece of literature serving as scripture. If we want to understand that, we need to try to push aside our own cultural understanding, our own cultural ideas that could distort our reading of the text. And we want to read it in its own context. Well, how do we get to that context? We can get to that context by reading other literature that's written in that context. True, that literature is not scripture. That literature is not inspired of God or anything of the sort. But that literature gives us windows into the ancient world. And without those windows, we wouldn't have much of an idea about what the ancient world was like. And so that's what we're trying to get at. People in that culture, and here I'm talking about ancient culture, whether it's Babylonians or Assyrians or Egyptians or Hittites or Israelites, people in that culture think differently than we do. And therefore, we want to try to understand that broad culture. Now, Babylonians are different from Egyptians, and Egyptians are different from Hittites, and Israelites are different than all of them. But there is some common ground that they all hold that is different from what we hold. So I simply want to read the text against that ancient cultural background. In larger issues, the Israelites thought more like Babylonians and Egyptians than they think like us. And that means if I want to understand their literature, I should understand it against the backdrop of their cultural context. In some ways, they're going to track right along with that cultural context. In other ways, they're going to be very different because God has given them revelation. And I want to understand all of that. The better I can understand the ancient world, the more foundation I can have for understanding the Bible in its cultural context. It is not written in a cultural vacuum. It is written against the culture of the ancient world. I can't possibly impose the ancient world on the Bible any more than I could impose Hebrew on the Old Testament. It's written in Hebrew, and it's written against the backdrop of that culture, whether it's agreeing with it or disagreeing with it.
Oh, that was an amazing response. And I have, well, 3 follow-up questions. The first one is, would you say that the title as pagan text or pagan literature would be misleading and prevent us from actually studying these as the background of the Old Testament?
Yes, actually, I would. I don't use that description because, in one sense, it's somewhat judgmental because it's a negative description. Now, it's true, I don't believe the mythological gods that the Babylonians or Egyptians believed in. So, to that extent, we sometimes call it pagan. But of course, to them, it was their beliefs about the world. It was the true reality of the world. And so in that sense, I want to compare it as a system of thought. And as a system of thought, of course, there are key differences, particularly in how you think about God and which gods are worshipped. But in many other areas, such as how do you think about history? Why do you talk about the past? And what do you think that helps to do? Israelites would think pretty much like Babylonians on that count, or Egyptians, more like the way we think about history. When you think about law, well, they would have thought about law and a judicial system much more like Babylonians and Assyrians do than like modern people do. So I just want to understand their culture so I don't impose my ideas and preconceptions on it. So yeah, pagan, I think we don't need a word like that. We can recognize it as mythological. It is. We can recognize it as ancient Near Eastern literature. It is. So there are various ways we could describe it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is again a follow-up on this, but I'm going to try to word it out. What is the evidence that the Genesis author was aware of this ancient Near Eastern literature, and what are the reasons to think that? And again, something that I want to add there, which ancient Near Eastern literature were used as a background, or we can use as background to understand Genesis?
That's a great question. And really, I have to start several steps back to get a running start into it. We have to remember that the ancient world is a hearing dominant world, not a text dominant world. That means that most information was spread about by oral transmission. And that includes texts, and that includes all sorts of information that they would have had. And so in that sense, lots of the knowledge that an Israelite would have had, both of their own traditions and of other traditions, of their own history and the history of other peoples, would have all come through oral, not textual means. The texts that are written are typically written in scribal schools, whether those scribal schools served the temple or served the palace. Scribal schools is where things were written because that's where those specialized group of people were actually learning to read and write, which most people were not able to do to any great extent. And so even when texts were written, basically the only ones that had access to them would have been the scribes or temple or palace personnel. In other words, they're not libraries of literatures that are circulating around for people to become aware of. So the question would be then, if I can modify your question a little bit, were the scribes of Israel, we can start there, were the scribes of Israel familiar with other ancient Near Eastern literature? We don't know much about the scribal schools in Israel. We have not yet found a scribal archive in Israel. So to some extent, we don't have near the information that we would like to have. But every indication we do have suggests that those scribal schools would have been in some degree international. That is, they would not have just been doing Hebrew literature. They also would have been learning other languages and their literatures. You know, we can talk about Moses being trained in the palace in Pharaoh's house in Egypt, and he would have learned scribal arts, and that would have involved not just Egyptian, but other languages as well, especially Akkadian, which was the language of Babylon and Assyria. So there was an international flavor to these major scribal schools. And we have every reason to think that Israel's scribal schools would have had a similar international flavor. Now, the only specific evidence that we have is there's a little fragment of a tablet that was found in Megiddo, an Israelite city, during what we call the Judges period, in that layer of excavations, and it has a segment of the Gilgamesh epic on it. That suggests that the scribal school at Megiddo was aware of the Gilgamesh epic and was copying it. If the scribes were copying it, there's also a good reason to believe that those traditions were also circulating orally. You can never prove what was circulating orally because it was circulating orally. So in that regard, it's not really quite a fair question for us to pose to say, how can you prove that they had that oral tradition? You know, go back in time. I don't know. There's nothing that could do that. So in that regard, we have very little hard evidence, but to some extent that's because the written documents are such a small portion of all of the traditions that were circulating around. Do we have other reasons when we read the biblical texts to think that they had access? Yes, there are many reasons to think that. That's not the same as that they are dependent. I don't talk about the biblical text as dependent on pieces of literature from the ancient Near East. I would say that it's not indebted to those pieces, but Israelite literature is embedded in the ancient world. And so there are many places where very, very subtly we can detect some sense that they are aware of that broader international literature. The Bible itself tells us this because Solomon is said to have gathered all the wisdom from the East. And that's what we have compiled in the book of Proverbs. So he admits it, that he's familiar, and that's part of the indication of his wisdom and the vastness of his resources. So those are various things that I could mention.
Thank you so much for that. Now, in your studies, you mentioned that we should differentiate between material creation and functional creation. Could you please explain what is the difference between these two conceptions, and why do you say that the conflicts between Genesis and scientific discoveries exist because Christians do not interpret the creation account as a functional creation?
Good. Of course, this gets at the very heart of my work. When I first started to recognize this distinction, that is, that you could talk about creation in material terms, or you could talk about it in some other ways. I was casting around trying to come up with what's the word I would use to contrast material. And the best I could come up with at the time was function. And I still use that and it still works, but I've come to think that there's another word that works better. And so more recently, when I've been talking about this contrast between material and something else, I've been using the term order. Now, I used that a little bit in my earliest work, but now I'm more inclined to make that the major word. I used to say that the creation account in Genesis 1, God is giving a role and a purpose and a function in an ordered system. And so even in that phrase, it's the ordered system that's the focus. So I would now talk about the idea that we could talk about God manufacturing the material for the physical world, or we could talk about an account that talks about God ordering the world. So let me talk about that distinction for a minute and see if that helps. Basically, it goes back to the question, what kind of creation account is this? And to even ask the question, let alone answer it, you need to recognize that there could be various kinds of creation accounts. Let me illustrate. Say that you're going to a play and you get tied up in traffic and construction and you can't find a parking spot, and you end up getting into the theater half hour late. And so intermission comes soon, and you say to the person next to you, how did the play begin? And the person replies, the script was written in 1934, and it was a very popular, and you say, no, I'm not interested in the script. And he would reply, well, you can't have a play without a script. You say, I know, but that's not what I'm asking. The person on the other side of you says, well, the theater was constructed in the 1950s, and this set was made to fit this theater for particularly this play. I say, no, I'm not interested in the theater or the set. And he would say, well, you can't have a play without a theater and a set. I say, I know, but that's not what I'm asking. And the person behind me says, well, the cast was chosen with this particular play in mind. I say, no, I'm not interested in the cast. Please tell me what's happened since the curtain opened. Now you can see in that illustration that all of those are right answers. And in fact, the play needs all of them. You couldn't have a play without all those pieces. But that doesn't mean you have to answer the question, how did the play begin, by going all the way back and talking about the script and the set and the cast. Those are correct answers. Those are legitimate answers. But there are other ways to answer that question. So we have to ask the question, what kind of creation account is this? Is it interested in the script or the set or the cast or the action? And that's really what I'm trying to get at. I'm not trying to suggest that God did not create the material world or that Israel somehow did not think God created the material world. I'm not suggesting that Israel was ignorant of the material world. What I am trying to suggest is that they're trying to tell a different sort of creation story. It's not that the others are wrong. It's just this is the one they want to tell because this had the most value to them. As far as I can tell, and I've read an awful lot of ancient literature, as far as I can tell, order is the highest value in the ancient world, and that includes Israel. And therefore, when they talk about creation, they're going to want to talk about order. See, for us, arguably, material is the most important value. In a scientific world, that's the case. And so we want to give a material account. And that's fine if you want to do that. But don't assume that the ancient audience has the same priorities that we do. They're not thinking science. They understand that there's a material world, but they really don't care. We talk about our computers, and if somebody asks you about your computer, you don't talk about the material that the case was made of. You talk about the apps and the operating systems, because we really don't care about the case. And so in that sense, we have to ask the question of them, what kind of creation account is this? And that's what I was using, that concept, when I talked about function. It's getting us into the concept of the way that creation functions. Another way I've come about to explain that is that you could talk about, if you think about the place where you live. I mean, I'm looking at your pictures and you've all got rooms and apartments and homes in the backdrop. If somebody asked you about the place where you lived, well, you could tell them about the plumbing and the air conditioning and the electricity and the foundation and the walls and the roof, but that's probably not what they're asking. When the place where you're living was built, that was the creation of the house. And if you described all of those things, you'd be giving a house story. And there's value to the house story. We're awfully glad we have all of those things. But there's another story to be told, and that's the home story. The home story is how you have taken that house and ordered it and organized it to be your home. And arguably, the home story is at least as important, if not more important, than the house story. It's true that in most cases, you can't have the home if you don't have the house. But likewise, you don't have to give the house story in order to give the home story. And when I look at Genesis 1, I'm more convinced that it's a home story, not a house story. And if that's true, then I would be doing an injustice to the text if I didn't read it that way. Now, that gets into the question you asked about scientific discoveries. The conflict that we sometimes feel between the Bible and science comes about when we have treated the Bible as if it's a house story. We've treated the Bible as if it's talking about the set. And I'm suggesting that if we think of the Bible as the home story, then it's really not comparable to the science story, which is a house story. House stories and home stories aren't trying to say the same thing. And therefore, they can't really conflict with one another if they're a different kind of creation account.
Okay, I'll need to come back to this interview and listen to this part over and over again. It's really, really good material. Antonio had a question on this specifically as well, especially related to Genesis 1:1. Antonio, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for all your arguments, Dr. Walton. I feel so grateful for all your work, and thanks for your time. So I have a few questions about the traditional lecture of Genesis 1:1, because for years this verse has taken as a proof text of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, the doctrine that asserts that God created the material universe out of nothing. If I am right, you affirm this doctrine, but you don't think that Genesis 1:1 is a good support for it. Can you please explain these reasons?
Sure. Fortunately, I've given the foundation for that in what I just said. That is, if this is a home story and not a house story, if it's not about the material cosmos, then creation out of nothing is not what it's after, because that's part of the house story. And by the way, of course, you're right. I do believe that it's a legitimate part of the house story. That is, when God did the material creation, he created out of nothing. I mean, the basic theological premise is there was no pre-existing eternal matter. And the Israelites wouldn't have thought there was pre-existing eternal matter. I don't think there's a pre-existing eternal matter. That means that when God created the material universe, he did it out of nothing. But again, what kind of creation account is this? Mm-hmm. If it's not a house story, if it's a home story, then they're not even talking about the material aspect of God's creative work.
Okay. I want to add a little follow-up. Sure. I understand that in your research, you have come to consider that material creation could be involved in the functional perspective. Is that right?
I do not say that Genesis 1 is dealing with both. When people say, why couldn't it be both? My answer is, well, theoretically, it could have been both, but we have to have evidence that it's both. I've tried to present evidence that it is focused on order rather than focused on material. If the biblical author wanted to discuss both, they could have done that, but I don't think they did. Okay, when you go all the way through, and I've done this in a couple places, go through day by day to demonstrate that there aren't material things being manufactured. You know, day one, it's day and night, it's time, it's light. Those are not material. Day two, it's empty space. That's not material. Day three, he just says, let the dry land emerge, let the food grow. And then he gets to let the fish swarm and let the birds swim. It doesn't say that he's creating these things materially. So my point is, if the author wanted it to be material, he would have said that. And he doesn't. He's talking about how material things are ordered, but he's really not talking about how material things came into existence. So my statement is, it theoretically could have been both, but I have to prove that it has to do with order, and somebody who thinks it's material has to prove that it's material. And I don't think it can be done. People would differ on that.
Okay.
Let me just ask this, Antonio, and then you can continue.
Yeah.
Would you say that if it can be proven that the text of Genesis 1 teaches both material creation and order, as you mentioned, would that put Genesis 1 in conflict with scientific discoveries? Like we have with trees before the sun, the order of the creation of the animals, and all of that.
It possibly could, but there are people who think that it's more material, but that also see a literary framework in Genesis 1 that suggests that even if it's material, this is not sequential. Okay, so that the 7 days aren't a sequence, they're set up in a literary pattern. Day 1 equals day 4, day 2 equals day 5, day 3 equals day 6. You've seen this, it's fairly common in reform circles especially. It's called the framework hypothesis, and it shows the literary structure. Lots of people who believe in the literary structure, the framework hypothesis, would say that this is still material creation, but they would say it's not presented in sequential order, and therefore you don't have to worry about plants before the sun or light before the heavenly bodies.
Mhm.
So that's a different way to go about it.
I have a similar question. What do you think about a double reading in which Genesis 1:1 is talking about the material creation of the universe, and from Genesis 1:2 to the conclusion, the author refers to the functional creation? Is this plausible? Why not?
There are many theories that can be proposed, and many of them have some evidence to support them, or at least some logic to support them. And so I don't want to dismiss them or shoot them down. I've considered that theory, but have not found it persuasive that shift should take place. In fact, I agree with quite a few other commentators that Genesis 1:1 is a literary introduction, that nothing happens in Genesis 1:1, that nothing's created. It just is telling you the story it's going to tell you. So I would translate it something like, in the beginning, God created the cosmos. Let me tell you how he did it. Starts out with the earth is right. So the story begins in verse 2. Genesis 1:1 is just a literary introduction. And the evidence that I would bring for that is that it can therefore be compared to the 11 Toledot introductions throughout the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is divided by the narrator into these segments, and they always have this literary introduction to open up the segment. And I think that Genesis 1:1 is that same thing. They can't call it Toledot because nothing's come before it. So it's called Bereshit, to the beginning, instead. But I think it's the same sort of literary introduction. And the text flows very well that way. I think that also works because when you come to the end of the chapter, the end of the 7 days, it says, and so in the 7 days, the Lord God created the heavens and the earth. That tells you that Genesis 1:1 is not something that happened before the 7 days. It's describing what is going to happen in the 7 days. So that's my logic. Remember, the strongest evidence is going to be the strongest interpretation is going to be the strongest interpretation because it has the strongest evidence. Different people weigh evidence in different ways, but that's basically our approach. Let's compile the evidence and see which one floats to the top by having the preponderance of evidence supporting it. Of course, people start with different presuppositions, and that can make a difference as well.
Thanks.
You're quite welcome. Keep thinking, Antonio.
Yeah, actually, Antonio is the one most familiar with your work from any of us, so it's great to have you here. Okay, let me go to the next one. Well, I think you already covered something like relevant to this. When God created the world, was everything in order, or were there parts left in a non-order state that then eventually needed to be ordered?
Well, the text makes it pretty clear that not everything is ordered. When the text keeps saying it is good, it is good, it is good, tov there, the Hebrew word tov, good, is not a moral designation. And it's certainly not the Hebrew word for perfect. It tells us that things are ordered, that they're functioning the way that they should. But not everything is fully ordered. We know that, number one, because sea and darkness are still there. Sea and darkness are the expressions of non-order, the most prominent expressions of non-order in the ancient world. And they're still there. So all of non-order has not been addressed. Secondly, we know that there's an outside the garden, and that the outside the garden is less ordered than inside the garden. And that means that order is not completed. Third, I don't know if I said there were just two, but the third reason is that when God creates people in his image, he creates them to be order bringers. So they are to subjugate and rule. Those are order bringing activities. And so he has created them to work alongside him to bring about his further ordering. And that suggests that everything is not fully ordered. Finally, number 4, I think this is the last one. When you go to Revelation 21, what do you find? You find that now there is perfect order, and there is no sea, and there is no darkness, and God's presence is everywhere. It's new creation that is fully ordered. And when we arrive at new creation, may that day come soon, we're not going back to Eden. Eden was not fully ordered. It was the first step, and it was optimally ordered. It's new creation that's going to be fully ordered. Those are my 4 reasons.
Very well. Well, you already touched upon the subject of this question, and actually this one comes from me. A few weeks ago, we also interviewed another scholar that hold to the cosmic temple view. And when I asked him about the 3 days before creation, the creation specifically of the sun and the moon, and how could this be? How could the 3 days exist there without the sun and moon? And he mentioned that in his view, God is used as the source of light for the first 3 days. And he argues in favor of this, saying that Isaiah and other prophets see the sun as a symbol of God, and that we also have pictographic and iconographic images from the time of the prophets that also depict God as the sun. Would you agree with this? Would you not agree with this, and why?
Well, that's not the explanation that I would give. It sounds like this person has accepted the cosmic temple view, but has not accepted the idea of Genesis 1 as the home story, that it's focusing on order, because it sounds like he's still treating it as if this is a chronological sequence of material. Well, I don't think that Genesis 1 is a chronological sequence of material. Even framework hypothesis people think that it's not a chronological sequence, even though they think it's material. I don't think it's material, and certainly don't think it's a chronological sequence. So in that sense, the days are prioritized with a different idea in mind. you might recall that when I talk about Genesis 1 as connected to temple building, I treat Genesis 1 as comparable to a temple inauguration. And a temple inauguration focuses on the functions and the larger order issues first: time, space, food, right? Then it gets to things like the furniture, and that's the heavenly bodies and the fish and the birds and the beasts. This is not sequential. It's not in an order of how things materially happened. It's a home story. And so in that sense, I'm not really bothered at all. I don't have to try to think of Yahweh as connected to the sun. It's true that there are some places where they compare Yahweh to the sun, or what the sun god in other cultures would have done. There's even a whole dissertation by Glenn Taylor on Yahweh and connected to the sun. So that stuff's out there, and I don't disagree with it. But I don't think we need that kind of explanation to work out Genesis 1.
Now that you've mentioned it, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, would you say that your view on the sacred space takes or is complemented? I don't know, you correct me, but from the framework view as well, or can you integrate them both? Are they mutually exclusive?
Good. Yes, they can be integrated. I fully agree with the literary structure that people in the framework hypothesis use. That literary structure is clear. I don't know how you could disagree with it. So I accept that. But most people who do framework hypothesis say it's literary, that's it. Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's ancient and it's focused on order. So it's not just a literary structure. There's something significant beyond the literary structure that's driving us to this understanding of God intending to dwell among his people and ordering the cosmos for that purpose and creating order bringers who will work alongside of him. So I think there's a whole lot more than the literary framework. But certainly I agree there's that literary framework.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a question that has always bothered me, because I wasn't sure if they were completely mutually exclusive of, or if somebody could integrate them. Okay, next question. Concerning the creatures in the account of Genesis, in your book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, Proposition 14, you talk about the creatures of chaos. What are the creatures of chaos exactly, for the persons that are not familiar with your work? And how do they relate to Genesis 1?
Very good question. So here I'm tapping into what we know about both the ancient Near East and the Bible. In the Bible, the most famous and well-known of chaos creatures is Leviathan. Job talks about him, Psalms talks about him, and so we have this Leviathan creature. And that's really not a biological, zoological specimen. They didn't expect to encounter one in the wild. In fact, they certainly hoped that they would not. It's a creature that is on the boundaries of the ordered world. And that's really the issue. When I use chaos, I'm just using the terminology other people use. But here with chaos, I'm not thinking about a creature connected with immoral behavior or wicked or evil or those sorts of things. It's an order category, not a moral category. So a chaos creature has 1 foot in the ordered world and 1 foot outside the ordered world. They're right at the boundaries of the ordered world. And many people would have considered them outside the realm of order, but the biblical text suggests otherwise. When Yahweh talks about Leviathan, he says, I created Leviathan to sport with him for my own amusement. Okay, and in that sense, he's not outside the ordered world, though he's outside of the human order. When Job, in the book of Job, Yahweh's second speech talks about Behemoth and Leviathan. Those are chaos creatures. It's not a hippopotamus and a crocodile. Crocodiles don't breathe fire. This is a chaos creature. But again, the idea is that these all have a role in God's larger order, even if they don't have a role in the human ordered world. And even the first speech of Yahweh talks about all of these other creatures, the ostrich and the wild horse, all out on the boundaries of order. And Yahweh saying, there is more order than what you know. Job and his friends believed they had it all nailed down. They knew how the world was supposed to work. And God said, you don't have a clue. There's more than you could ever know. Now, coming back to Genesis 1 then, in Genesis 1:21, it talks about creating the great sea creatures. And again, the Tanin are chaos creatures. But here it's very clear that God has created them as he is ordering the world. And so again, even though human beings may not have incorporated them into their ordered world, they are part of the ordered world that Yahweh created. And again, you might recall that I come back to that idea in Genesis 3, because I also consider the serpent to be a chaos creature. Again, not intrinsically evil, but kind of throwing a monkey wrench into everything, messing things up, bringing chaos and non-order. I talk about three categories. There's non-order, which is not evil or moral, it's just not ordered yet. And that's the normal state of things. Then there's order. God imposes order when he creates, but order has to be sustained or else it falls apart. So back to non-order. So you've got non-order, order, but then disorder. Disorder is when someone is working against the order that someone else is bringing. And so in that sense, the serpent is not so much representing disorder, but representing non-order. Okay, it's people that are responsible for sin. They made the choice. The serpent is the catalyst, just kind of the instigator of thinking outside the box, not in very good ways. So that's chaos creatures. They're known in the ancient world. They're known in the biblical text. And again, that's another way that if we don't understand the ancient world, we are going to fail to understand the biblical text. So that's all if we call it mythological or pagan or whatever we call it, it's our knowledge of the ancient world that can help clarify these issues in the biblical text.
I think that's there's so many things that we can follow up from here, but I want to get to the questions of Adam and Eve. I just one small follow-up. If the text is so clear that these creatures, for example, in Job, breathe fire, why would somebody try to interpret this creature to be part of the natural animal realm, like some people do? Try to interpret it as a crocodile, as a hippopotamus, or whatever.
I can't explain other people's interpretations. I suspect it's mostly because they wanted to make it fit within the framework of our natural world. Whereas I'm suggesting we have to think ancient terms, and therefore we've got more categories than what our modern views look at.
Okay. Well, let's go to Adam and Eve. This will open a can of worms on its own as well. How do Adam and Eve fit into the cosmic temple view or the sacred space view?
Well, actually, once you have the sacred space view in place, you've got something that makes a lot more sense in Genesis 2, because that's what the Garden of Eden is. God is there in the garden, and so it's sacred space. In the ancient world, gardens typically were adjoining temples and palaces, and what was grown in the gardens was offered to the god. Here you've got a twist, because God plants the garden to give food to people instead of people giving food to God. Okay, but again, you wouldn't recognize that contrast if you didn't know the ancient world and how things typically worked there. So the Garden of Eden is sacred space. Ezekiel calls it the Garden of God. We know that God meets with Adam and Eve there, although we're told very little about it. So it's a place of God's presence, and therefore it's sacred space. And that's how Genesis 1 fits into it. I'm sorry, Genesis 2. Genesis 1 told you that God created the world to dwell in it, but it doesn't tell you where. Genesis 2 now explains how God's dwelling place is there among people.
In your view, because there's so many things in the text that seem fantastic or supernatural, if I'm using the term correctly, like the trees of the garden, the waving sword, God visiting the garden, the creation of Adam from dust, the creation of Eve from Adam's rib. How are we to understand these? Are these literal descriptions of what happened? Symbolical? Another thing? What are your thoughts on this?
My commitment is to always try to read the text the way the author wants me to read it. If the author intends something to be a metaphor or figurative, then I'd better read it that way. You know, if Jesus intended his lessons to be parables, I better read them that way. If God as a rock is intended to be a metaphor, I better not ask whether it's sedimentary or igneous. We want to track with the author. That's always my commitment. Now, there's some things where it's not so clear what the author's intentions are. The trees of the garden, for instance, you could read them as actual trees with actual properties that were there for people to eat from the tree of life, to not eat from the tree of wisdom. You could treat them that way. You could also treat them as symbolic of what they represent. The tree of life means that God is the source of life, and the tree of wisdom, God is the source of wisdom, and you could treat them as figurative. My question always is, what's my best shot at what the author intended me to think? Now, again, that's not always discernible, but that's what I'm committed to. But many times I can only make it my best guess. In a case like that, with the trees and the fruit, I tend to take the default as being that I should read them as actual trees and fruit. And maybe that's not a good impulse, but that's the way I've typically done it. So until I see reason to think otherwise, that's the way I'm going to treat it. But even when I do that, I want to recognize that the importance is not the trees and fruit themselves as physical things. The importance still is what they represent. God is the source and giver of life and wisdom. And if we miss that and just treat them as botanical, we're missing the boat. When you get to things like the dust and the rib, you again have to think, what is the author trying to get at? As you know, I've treated Adam and Eve as archetypes in Genesis 2. And that means that there is something bigger than them going on. Archetype doesn't say they aren't real people in a real past. I believe they are. But archetype says there's something going on that's bigger than them that pertains to everyone. And so dust, the Bible is very clear, dust equals mortality. Dust you are, to dust you shall return. And the psalmist says, you remember that we are but dust, you know our form, and we're just dust. Old Testament, New Testament, everybody knows this, dust equals mortality. So that's what's important there. It doesn't actually say that Adam is made from dust. That preposition is not there in Hebrew. Those of you who have Hebrew, check it out. It's the Lord God formed Ha'adam, break, dust of the earth. That says what he is. It doesn't say what he's from. And if it's saying what he is, that becomes very quickly metaphor for something else, which we know is mortality. Rib, likewise, I would question the translation. This term is not used anatomically anywhere else in the Bible, anywhere else in the Old Testament, of course. And when it is used in architecture, it refers to a side. So I think it's that God took Adam's side. Furthermore, the text suggests that this happens in a vision, not on a surgical table. So again, I don't go the scientific route with anesthesia and surgical procedures. I think in terms of a vision where he sees himself cut in half, and half of him becomes, made into woman. So that's a vision. That's different from figurative. What you see in a vision, again, certainly it has symbolic value. I mean, he wasn't missing half of him when he woke up. Okay, but it's got symbolic value to say that man and woman are the same stuff here.
Again, I'm gonna have to come back and listen it 2 or 3 times. Very well. Do you think the concept of the divine counsel occupies a relevant position to interpret the first chapters of Genesis?
I don't think it's important for the interpretation of these chapters, but I think there's a brief appearance, and I'm speaking of the plurals in Genesis 1:26 through 28 or so. Let us make man in our image. I think that if we read the text in light of the author's intentions, and remember, that's my commitment. The author's got the authority. It's God's authority, but God placed it in the authors, and therefore, if I'm going to get God's authoritative message, I better track with the authors through whom he gave it. So I am accountable to the author's intentions. So how would the author have read this? Certainly not as the Trinity. The author doesn't know anything about the Trinity. And God's speaking through the author to his audience, and they're expected to understand it. What did they understand? To me, that's where the divine counsel comes in. It's a modified view of the divine counsel, different from what Babylon or Egypt would have had, because they have pantheons. Israel doesn't. Yet we know that the Israelites believed in the divine counsel. We've got 1 Kings 22. We've got Isaiah 6. The divine counsel's at work. We've got Psalm 82. We've got Job 1. We know that they have this concept of a divine counsel. And so we should read the plurals in that light. Now, that doesn't really get you anywhere important in the interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, but it's there.
All right. Now we're going to go back to something that you already mentioned as well, and that's the role of the serpent. In the account of Adam and Eve, the serpent occupies a central role. Traditional interpretations of the book establish that the serpent in the garden was Satan, the devil, as it's known in the New Testament. However, you say that the Israelite people from the time of the Old Testament did not understood the serpent in this way. And 2 questions arise. And let me read the first one, and then we're going to go to the second one. What is the role of the serpent in the ancient Middle East or ancient Near Eastern context?
Well, as I've mentioned, I believe that the serpent is a chaos creature here. I'm fully aware, of course, of the long tradition that has associated the serpent with the devil. But in Israelite thinking, they had no devil. They had no space for a devil. They had no concept of a devil. That is, to talk about an evil being that was in conflict with God. They have no devil. They've got a character that they refer to as Satan. Of course, Satan is a Hebrew word. So they've got this character, Satan, but they did not consider him the devil. They considered Satan to be a functionary of God. He reports to God. God gives him things to do. He permits him to do some things, and the Satan plays its role. That's in Job 1, that's in Zechariah 3, and not very much anywhere else. So the Old Testament, the Israelites do not have a developed view of Satan, and they do not have a devil role, a devil cap for him to play. He doesn't play that role. Again, this is all part of what I've been saying, that we need to interpret the Old Testament in light of the author's intentions. If the authors show no evidence, and they don't, they show no evidence of having any devil role, then we can't read that into the text, just from our own theology. That doesn't say there isn't a devil or that Satan isn't the devil, but those things aren't developed in the Old Testament. And if we're trying to understand the Old Testament, we are accountable to the author's intentions. Now remember, that's just the first step. Our first step is accountability to the authors. We're going to move beyond that. We're going to move into the rest of the Old Testament, into the Second Temple Judaism period, into the New Testament, into church history, and all of those stages are important to us. And eventually we want the text to mean something to us in our world. All important steps. But I think we need to take them in order instead of just bunching them all together. Instead of starting with our theology and reading it in, let's start with what the author intended. Because if the authority of God is given through the author, then we have an obligation to understand the author if we're going to get the authority of God. I hope that logic is clear enough. It's a pretty basic aspect. So the serpent in the Middle East would have been a chaos creature. We encounter serpents that way in the Egyptian coffin texts, especially in Egyptian literature. We encounter them that way in Mesopotamian literature. No surprise that the Israelites also would consider the serpent in the category of chaos creature. But I'm not sure that we haven't given him too central a role in Genesis 3. As you mentioned, the Old Testament never refers to him again. How central can that be in their thinking if they never mention him again? Paul and Augustine and Calvin and others all along the way have seen a role for the serpent. And I'm not disagreeing with any of them. But I'm saying if we start with the Old Testament, we won't start with Paul or Augustine or Calvin. We'll start with the Old Testament. And in that sense, they don't know that it's a devil. They don't know that it's Satan. They don't consider this the central moral moment of history. They just don't treat it that way. And I'd rather start by reading it the way they read it.
Okay, very good. Well, at this point, I want to open it. David, do you have a comment? Anybody else as well after David?
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Walton, for all of these insights that you have given to us tonight. And I would like to make you two questions about the role of the serpent. If you say that the serpent is a non-order creature that is not inherently evil, could we say that Adam and Eve were not tempted by the serpent? And in that case, who tempted Adam and Eve to sin against God? Is the text of Genesis implying that Adam and Eve committed a sin in itself, or what do you think?
It depends how broadly or narrowly you define temptation. The serpent never suggested to them that they should eat the fruit. The serpent never suggested that they should disobey God. The serpent asked questions. The serpent probed their curiosity. Temptation, broadly speaking, well, since he brought it to their attention and made them think about it, that could constitute temptation. And again, when the New Testament or our theology talks about this being the temptation, I'm not going to argue with that. But again, we have to understand it in that sense broadly rather than narrowly. The serpent is merely suggestive.
Okay. And I had another question, Dr. Walton, about the same topic, Satan. And do you believe that the traditional story of Satan, that he was an archangel and he sinned against God and he fell down in the face of God, and one third of the angels followed him and they became demons, and the traditional story about the devil, do you think that story would be at odds with with the thinking of the ancient Near Eastern and the Old Testament times, or as in a material and functional conceptions, they wouldn't necessarily be in contradiction one another. What do you think?
Well, the whole part about 1/3 of the angels kicked out of heaven comes from Revelation, and it's talking about the future. So we can't pull from that something that is a story about the past. It's a story about the future. The tradition that you've cited, of course, has stood for a long time, but lots of times when people support it, they support it from Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28, and neither of those mention Satan. Both of them tell you exactly who they are talking about, and they're perfectly understandable in the context that the prophet gives. And I choose to believe the prophet that he's talking about the Prince of Tyre in Ezekiel and the King of Babylon in Isaiah. There's no reason we should think of those as referring to Satan. Now, of course, people often have, but he's never mentioned there. If I'm going to track with the authors, I'm not going to find a story about Satan's fall there. And so you have to ask the question, if we're going to accept this tradition of Satan's fall, where do we get it? If we don't get it from Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, and if Revelation's talking about the future, where do we get it? You know, Jesus certainly says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Well, that doesn't tell us much about it if he is talking about a primeval fall. Remember that he says that right after the disciples have returned from a ministry of casting out demons. He could be talking about that. So we don't have a lot of biblical information. And I'm myself a little bit wary about building a whole theological construction on things that we don't have biblical text to support. If you're interested in this topic, I've talked about it some in my book, How to Read Job. I talked about it some in Lost World of Adam and Eve, but it's probably most in a book that I did with my son, my most recent publication, Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology. And that's where you'd find the largest discussion of this text about Genesis 3, about Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, the whole issue of the fall of Satan, and etc. Chaos, creature, the whole works. Demons and Spirits in Biblical Theology.
All right. Thank you for that recommendation of your book. Is your book already on sale?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, I think you can get it on Kindle for like $2.99, something like that. It's very cheap on Kindle, not very cheap in paperback edition.
All right, I get it. So thank you very much, Dr. Walton, for your answers. Very interesting answers. So another person who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, there was one here. Somebody sent it in Spanish. I'm gonna translate. And after that, if somebody wants to also do a question directly, they're open to do it. Okay, it says this. Dr. Walton, I wanted to know what you thought about the hypothesis of the majestic plural as an explanation of the events when God talks in plural.
Right. The plural of majesty is how we say it in English usually. You rendered it well. So the plural of majesty, which is just saying that, for instance, the Queen of England would speak as we, talking about kind of the whole royal house. It's a theory that's been presented. It hasn't received a lot of support, primarily because there's not a lot of evidence that biblical Hebrew uses plural of majesty, or that the rest of the ancient Near East does. So it's just lacking evidence to substantiate it as their common usage.
Very well. Anybody wants to do a direct question?
Dr. Walton, I was thinking about the comment you said about the first verse of Genesis 1, about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And am I right in saying that kind of verse is similar, for example, the accounts of Abraham or the generations of Isaac and another genealogies in Genesis, for example, these are the generations of Abraham, these are the generations of Isaac, and so on. So would it be the verse of Genesis 1 the same kind of those introductory verses?
Yes, exactly. Those are the ones that I called the Toledot, and pardon me for using a Hebrew term, but it's the one that you just translated as generations. And yes, that is exactly what I claim, that Genesis 1:1 is that same kind of statement that tracks throughout the book.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Doctor.
Go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Walton.
Okay.
I've got one question, and it's about some people reject this interpretation, the cosmic temple interpretation, because they say that this interpretation is not found in theologians of the past, right? We do not find it in the church fathers or in the reformers and so on. So with this objection or looking at this, they reject this modern interpretation. What would you say or respond to it?
Thank you. The support I give, the evidence I give for the theory comes from the Bible. And I'm content if I can support it from the Bible, even if I can't support it from other interpreters of the past. However, some people have found indications of this kind of reading, in passing at least, in some of the early interpreters. It's not common, but in one sense we can say it's not common because none of those interpreters had any access to the ancient world. I mean, I'm supporting it from the Bible, but I'm also supporting it from what we learn from the ancient world that is also doing the same thing that the Bible is doing. That is that the whole cosmos is the place of the presence of God, and that the temple represents the cosmos. All of those ideas are present in the ancient world, but I'm not getting it just from the ancient world. I'm getting it from the Bible, but the two are in agreement, but people might have missed it if they weren't familiar with the ancient world. The idea of God resting in a temple, you can find that in the Old Testament, but yet people ignored it, and they keep asking questions like, what's this whole idea about God resting? Well, he rests in his temple. The Old Testament, the Psalms tell us this. So in that sense, we've sometimes lost track of some of that as we've lost track of the ancient world. So I'm content if I have biblical support, even if I don't have support from some of the people, by the way, who I deeply respect in the world of interpretation of the church.
Thank you.
It's really interesting, and as I mentioned, we could be here another 3-4 hours following all the subjects that came up. It's amazing of everything that we can learn, and we appreciate you being with us today, Dr. Walton. But unfortunately, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to do a final question for our viewers here. What literature would you recommend to get more familiar with these subjects? Maybe follow up from this interview. Maybe somebody that has read your books on the Lost World series. What would you recommend?
Right. Well, of course, the Lost World series is a good place to start. And so, we do have the Lost World of Genesis 1. Let me get this right. Okay, the Lost World of Genesis 1, and the Lost World of Adam and Eve, and the Lost World of the Flood. So those are good places to start for some of the basic information. You can see some of my work in conversation with others in a book like 4 Views on the Historical Adam. And so you could check that out, or reading Genesis 1 and 2 would be another place to get some of that. If you want to move beyond mine and see some some comparison. We've got a book that came out recently to cover the theological issues, Reformed Theology and Evolutionary Theory. And that's an excellent book. And one that just came out a couple weeks ago, Lauren Harzma's When Did Sin Begin? And so these are books that can help you understand the whole aspect of things. Also, I update the way I talk about this all the time. Not so much that I change my mind, but you've heard me I talk about order instead of function, and the illustrations I've used. And so I'm doing that all the time. Almost every time I speak somewhere, they put it up on YouTube. So you could go to YouTube and find some of my recent presentations that talk through all of this. There's a recent one that was called the Lost World Conference in Seattle, and you can go on YouTube and you can find the whole thing. And so that could help some people who wanted to get more information.
Okay, would you recommend other authors maybe, or people that hold to this view?
I've found a lot of people affirming what I've done, but they aren't writing about it this time because, well, I'm writing about it. And that's, some of the books that I told you about talk about my view and either integrated into theirs, like the book on Reformed Theology and Evolutionary Theory, or that talk about mine and compare it to others, like Lauren Harzma's book. So you can find this in lots of different ways, but not a lot of people are publishing kind of my view and taking it further.
Okay. Well, let me just say this in Spanish. El libro del Dr. Walton ya está en español. Dejen nada más lo acomodo aquí para que se vea.
Yep.
Bueno, si alguien lo puede ver, lo tiene.
Lost World,
Este libro, también está el otro, ¿no? El de Adán y Eva. ¿Alguien puede confirmar?
Sí, también está.
¿Nada más son esos dos? ¿El mundo perdido de Génesis 1 y el mundo perdido de Adán y Eva? ¿O hay algún otro?
El que va a mencionar David, hace rato preguntó.
El de la Biblia, David.
La Biblia. Sí.
¿La tienes ahí a la mano?
Aquí la tengo. También, bueno, yo la tengo en inglés, pero la verdad es que sí es una joya de tomo. Aquí lo pueden ver, estimado público. The Cultural Backgrounds Story Bible. El Antiguo Testamento lo comenta el hermano Walton y el Nuevo Testamento lo comenta Craig Keener, ¿sí? Por aquí nos comentan que también esta Biblia se encuentra en español. Honestamente, yo no la he buscado de una manera apropiada para poderla encontrar, pero me comentan que sí está por ahí. Ahora, si ustedes quieren aprender buen inglés, pueden comenzar también con esta Biblia y si ya dominan la lectura de este idioma, la pueden buscar. De verdad, es una joya y a juzgar por el contenido de conocimientos que se aprenden de los contextos de la época en que se escribió la Biblia, vale mucho la pena pagar ese precio. Vale muchísimo la pena y a veces he visto que se la encuentran en descuento en Amazon como en unos 600, 800 pesos. Vale mucho la pena.
You might have just mentioned it, but the Lost World of Adam and Eve is also in Spanish, right? You showed
Yes.
the Lost
Sí.
World of Genesis 1, but they're
Yes,
both,
it's here.
Yes.
All right.
That's the one.
Okay.
Yes.
Very well. David, you want to close up?
Okay. So right now we are going to finish up our session. So, estimado público, ya aquí lo pudimos estar analizando este tema con el distinguidísimo doctor John Walton y les damos muchas gracias por haberse quedado con nosotros en esta hora y media de puro contenido de calidad, de una cosmovisión o más bien una concepción diferente, pero a la vez rica en conocimientos y en estudios de los contextos culturales del antiguo cercano oriente, y vale mucho la pena considerar la visión del doctor John Walton, porque él ha estado estudiando de cerca cada uno de estos contextos y los hemos podido escuchar en esta noche. Así que de verdad les invitamos a que compren esos libros, a que compren la Biblia de Estudios Culturales, a que se puedan empapar en la obra del doctor Walton y ustedes van a tener una visión más amplia y mucho más rica de cómo interpretar o leer el libro de Génesis y también de las primeras historias de este maravilloso libro. Así que bueno, nos despedimos y les agradecemos mucho su presencia. Dr. Walton, thank you very much for your presence here. It's been a huge honor, and we wish that God bless your ministry and your life and your family. And we hope that in a future, God willing, we can have another session with you in order to discuss another important topic. Dr. Walton, thank you very much. And in behalf of Reasonable Faith and all of us that are here, we desire you the best.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias a usted, estimado, y también a todos nuestros compañeros de Fe Razonable, a Job, a Juan Sebastián, a Fernando, a Raúl Jaramillo. Raúl, muchas gracias por la labor de traducción de las preguntas en este momento. Muchas gracias por tomar ese liderazgo, Raúl.
No hay de qué, David, un gusto estar participando aquí también, aprendiendo. Parece una cátedra que acabamos de tener.
Por supuesto, esto fue una conferencia magistral y el compromiso es de que la estemos viendo varias veces para captar todo lo que estuvimos escuchando. También muchísimas gracias, Alan, por tu ayuda en toda la edición de esta grabación, de este video. Muchísimas gracias por siempre ahí estar con nosotros y para nosotros, Alan. Y bueno, vamos a finalizar entonces. Les deseamos que tengan una excelente noche en cualquier parte del mundo donde se encuentren. Que Dios los bendiga, que Dios les guarde, que sean exitosos en su trabajo y nos estaremos viendo para otra entrevista más o para alguna conferencia más con algún gran erudito o alguna gran erudita acerca de temas relevantes en nuestra vida cristiana. Hasta luego y que Dios les bendiga.